Stephen LaWayne Nelson was born on February 18, 1987. He grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. Nelson was a high school dropout and laborer with a long history of legal trouble. His criminal record started as early as age 6. By his early 20s, he had numerous arrests and convictions. In the years before the incident, he was on probation for assaulting his girlfriend. But that didn't stop him. His violence was escalating. On March 3, 2011, Nelson was 24 years old. That morning, he decided to rob North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. At approximately 10 a.m., Nelson entered the church. 2 people were inside at the time. Clint Dobson was a 28-year-old pastor. He was married and beloved by his congregation. Judy Elliott was a 69-year-old secretary who had worked at the church for years. Nelson attacked both of them. Dobson was beaten viciously. Nelson used a computer extension cord to strangle him. Then he placed a plastic bag over Dobson's head and suffocated him. The pastor fought for his life but couldn't escape. He passed away in his own church. Judy Elliott was severely beaten. She suffered internal bleeding in her brain. Her face, head, arms, legs, and back were covered in traumatic injuries. She was beaten so badly that when her husband arrived at the church later that day, he didn't immediately recognize her. Elliott's husband was the church's part-time music minister. He found both individuals and called for help. Elliott survived but would live with those injuries for the rest of her life. After causing Dobson to pass away and assaulting Elliott, Nelson stole items from the church. He took Dobson's laptop. He took Elliott's credit cards. He took her car keys and drove away in her vehicle. 2 days later, on March 5, 2011, police arrested Nelson. He was driving Elliott's car. Inside the vehicle, police found several items belonging to both individuals. The evidence was overwhelming. Nelson's fingerprints were found at the crime scene. Pieces of his broken belt were discovered. Drops of the individual's blood were on his sneakers. Surveillance video showed him driving Elliott's car and using her credit cards. Nelson was charged with capital offense. His trial began in October 2012 in Tarrant County. Against his legal representation's wishes, Nelson took the stand to testify. He admitted he was at the church during the robbery, but he claimed he was only a lookout. He said he waited outside for about 25 minutes. He claimed 2 other men, Anthony Springs and Claude Jefferson, went inside and caused the violence. He said when he finally entered, Dobson was still alive. He insisted he didn't harm anyone, but prosecutors presented evidence showing this was a lie. Nelson's fingerprints were inside the church. His belt was used in the attack. The individual's blood was on his shoes. Investigators said Springs and Jefferson had alibis. The jury didn't believe Nelson's story. The judge instructed the jury using the law of parties. This meant they could convict Nelson in 2 ways. Either he directly caused Dobson to pass away, or he participated in a robbery that he should have known could result in death. On October 16, 2012, all 12 jurors unanimously found Nelson guilty of capital offense. They sentenced him to death. Nelson was 25 years old. After his sentencing, Nelson flooded the courtroom with black fire retardant liquid. He broke a fire sprinkler in retaliation against the judge and jury. Nelson spent 13 years on death row at the Polunsky unit near Livingston, Texas. While awaiting trial in Tarrant County Jail, he developed a violent reputation. He got into fights with guards and other inmates. He was initially charged with causing another inmate named Jonathan Holden to pass away, but the state dropped the case. He broke the sprinkler system in the day room and played in the spray. When he left for prison, Tarrant County jailers breathed a sigh of relief. But on death row, Nelson changed. In 2020, he met Helene Noah Dubois through a prison pen pal site. Dubois was from France and had moved to Montreal. She was looking for friendship. They started writing letters. Eventually they fell in love. They married while Nelson was in prison. Dubois said she didn't recognize the violent man described in court records. She saw someone different, someone who had changed. He claimed his trial didn't adequately explore Springs and Jefferson's involvement. He argued that better legal representation would have changed the verdict, but every appeal failed. On January 28, 2025, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected his last-minute appeal. On February 5, 2025, just hours before his execution, the United States Supreme Court rejected his final request for a stay. There were no more options. That evening, Nelson was taken to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. His wife Dubois was allowed to bring her white service dog into the witness area. She held the dog up to the window so Nelson could see. Dubois's family members were present. Elliott's son Bradley attended on behalf of his mother who had passed away in 2024. Nelson's spiritual advisor, Father Jeff Hood, a Catholic priest and death penalty activist, stood with him. Hood read scripture from a worn leather Bible with his hand on Nelson's forehead. Nelson whispered to him, "You didn't fail me, you did enough." For his final statement, Nelson addressed only his wife. He told Dubois that he would always love her no matter what. He said their love is uncontrollable, there is no definition. He said, "I'm thankful and grateful, it is what it is. Always live for me and enjoy life." He added, "I'm not scared. I'm at peace. I'm ready to be at home. Let's ride, Warden." As the lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing into his arms at 6:26 p.m., Nelson told Dubois, "Let me go to sleep." His body shook as the drug took effect. He gasped twice and appeared to try to hold his breath. His head, shoulders, and arms trembled for a few seconds. Then all movement stopped. At 6:50 p.m. on February 5, 2025, Stephen LaWayne Nelson was pronounced deceased. He was 37 years old, just 12 days before his 38th birthday. Dubois's family released a statement. They said they chose to focus on great memories of Clint rather than giving time to his offender. "Stephen Nelson forever changed our lives, but he has never occupied our minds. We miss Clint every day. We miss his laughter and his wit, his advice and his love for us." Elliot's son Bradley said, "I hope that today, as Mr. Nelson took his last breath, that he was greeted by the same loving and gracious Savior that has stood by us. Mr. Nelson, we forgive you and hope to see you when we are called home." Matthew Lee Johnson was born on September 17, 1975 in Dallas County, Texas. He was raised in a challenging environment mainly by his brothers and cousins. Johnson exhibited signs of instability and criminal behavior from an early age. He began using marijuana as early as age 7. His criminal history started at age 15 with an arrest for car theft and escalated over the years. In 1994, he was arrested for violently resisting law enforcement and biting police officers. He had a theft arrest from a former employer in 2011. In 2004, Johnson was sentenced to 5 years in prison following a robbery. He was released in 2009. His attorneys say he was clean and sober inside prison and for 2 years after release. At the time of his trial, he was married and had 3 daughters. But in 2011, Johnson relapsed after his wife lost her job shortly after they bought their first home. He returned to using crack cocaine. By May 2012, his addiction had consumed him. On the morning of May 2012, Nancy Judith Harris began her opening shift at the Fina Whippin convenience store in Garland, Texas. Harris was 76 years old. She was a great-grandmother. She had worked at the store for more than 10 years. She lived only about a block and a half away. She had 4 sons, 11 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. Every Friday was Nini Day. She would pick up her youngest grandchildren from school. They would go to McDonald's and Dollar Tree. Then they would go back to her house to play and spend time together. She was at every single event her grandchildren had. Every game, every performance, everything. That morning would be her last shift. Johnson entered the store shortly after Harris arrived around 7 a.m. Surveillance video captured everything. Johnson was carrying a lighter and a plastic bottle that contained lighter fluid. He went behind the sales counter where Harris was working. He began pouring lighter fluid over Harris's head while demanding money from her. As Harris complied and opened the cash register, Johnson stole cigarettes and lighters from an overhead area. He wrenched Harris's ring off her right hand. After taking cash from the register, he flicked a lighter. Harris ignited immediately. Flames engulfed her body. Johnson calmly left the store, pocketing candy bars on his way out. Johnson's trial began in 2013. His guilt was never in question. The surveillance video showed everything. On the stand, Johnson admitted to setting Harris on fire. He claimed he had been high after smoking $100 worth of crack cocaine. He said he was trying to use the lighter fluid as a scare tactic to get her to back away. He testified that he didn't intend to cause her to pass away, but he also called himself the lowest scum of the earth. He said, "I hurt an innocent woman. I took a human being's life. I was the cause of that. It was not my intentions to cause her to pass away or to hurt her, but I did." His attorneys presented testimony about his long history of drug addiction starting at age 7 and sexual mistreatment he experienced as a child. A week before the attack, Johnson asked local police to arrest him because he needed help, but officers refused. On November 8, 2013, Matthew Lee Johnson was unanimously sentenced to death. He remained emotionless throughout the sentencing and victim impact statements. Johnson spent 12 years on death row at the Polunsky Unit near Livingston, Texas. He participated in the faith-based program which began in 2021, making Texas the first state to offer such a program to condemned inmates. During his time on death row, his attorneys filed multiple appeals. They argued that the Texas Attorney General's office unfairly influenced his death sentence by suggesting execution dates to the court. On November 18, 2015, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected his direct appeal, affirming his conviction and death sentence. All subsequent appeals failed. In April 2025, his attorneys submitted an application for clemency to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. The application acknowledged, to be sure, Ms. Harris's incident was horrific and it was committed by Matthew Johnson. Mr. Johnson understands the harm he has caused and is deeply regretful. The Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty argued that Johnson's drug addiction had plagued him for most of his life in the free world and caused him to become a different person. They said that removed from any access to cocaine during his 12 years on death row, Johnson had not been a threat to anyone, but the board denied his clemency request. On May 18, 2025, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals denied his final stay of execution. On May 20, 2025, exactly 13 years to the day of his offense, Johnson was taken to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. Harris's family members attended. 3 sons, 2 daughters-in-law and a granddaughter watched through the window. When asked for his final statement, Johnson turned his head and looked at Harris's relatives. "As I look at each one of you, I can see her on that day," he said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I please ask for your forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her," he added. "I pray that she's the first person I see when I open my eyes, and I spend eternity with her." He also addressed his wife and daughters. "I ask that you forgive me for giving up on you and walking away. Just know that it's nothing that you did. I made wrong choices, I've made wrong decisions, and now I pay the consequences." As the lethal dose of pentobarbital began taking effect at 6:27 p.m., Johnson gasped several times, then made repeated sounds like snoring. Within a minute, all movement stopped. At 6:53 p.m. on May 20, 2025, Matthew Lee Johnson was pronounced deceased. He was 49 years old. Harris's family had little reaction to Johnson's words and declined to speak with reporters. But daughter-in-law Elizabeth Harris sent a statement describing Nancy as an amazing grandmother who was at every single event her grandchildren had. Attorney General Ken Paxton released a statement. "Matthew Johnson has been executed and received the just punishment for the senseless, horrifying incident of Nancy Harris. While nothing can restore the innocent life that was taken, he will never be able to hurt anyone again. Vicious offenders must be held responsible for their actions, and I will never stop working to ensure that justice is done." Blaine Keith was born on December 12, 1989 in Gregg County, Texas. By age 18, Milam already had a troubling criminal record. At the time of Amora Carson's incident, he was on probation. He had previously entered the home of an 11-year-old neighbor and left a stack of pages torn from pornographic magazines, marked with salacious notes, in her dresser drawer. Milam was engaged to Jessica Carson, also 18. They lived together in a trailer home outside Tatum, about 15 miles southeast of Longview in East Texas. Jessica had a 13-month-old daughter named Amora Bain Carson. Milam was raising the baby as if she were his own daughter. He called himself her daddy. But what happened to Amora would shock investigators to their core. On December 12, 2008, at 10:37 a.m., Milam dialed 911. "My name is Blaine Milam, and my daughter, I just found her deceased." Sergeant Kevin Roy of the Rusk County Sheriff's Department arrived 20 minutes later. 2 ambulances were already there. EMTs were standing in the doorway of the master bedroom where Milam and Carson were kneeling on the floor. Sergeant Roy saw an infant laying on the floor, not moving, bruised. The baby was laying on its back, and the face of the baby was just one large bruise. What investigators found next was the worst crime scene they had ever seen in 30 years of law enforcement. Amora had severe injuries all over her tiny body. Human bite marks covered her. She had skull and rib fractures, bleeding under her scalp, a lacerated liver, a broken arm and leg, a bleeding blood vessel in her neck, consistent with strangulation. She had been harmed in unspeakable ways. Dr. Keith Pinkard, a forensic pathologist with the Southwest Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas, testified at Milam's trial. "I've never seen anything like it. It's the worst thing I've seen in 30 years of law enforcement," said Lieutenant Reynold Humber. "All injuries were inflicted while baby Amora was still alive. She suffered for 30 hours. Milam and Carson were interviewed separately. Milam told investigators that he and Carson had left Amora alone and walked to meet with Clark Timber in Longview about a business matter. But Shane and Dwight Clark denied meeting with Milam that day. Surveillance video showed Milam and Carson at a pawn shop in Henderson that morning, pawning a chainsaw and air hammer. They were reportedly trying to raise money to pay a priest to perform an exorcism. Milam changed his story multiple times. He said they found Amora in a hole in the floor of the bathroom he was remodeling with a blood ring around her mouth, biting insulation. He said she was still breathing when he called 911. Then he said Carson called 911 while they were looking for her, and when they found her she was deceased. Texas Ranger Kenny Ray interviewed Milam. Ray told Milam he knew he was lying and that most people would suspect that he, as the only male in the house, beat Amora to death. Milam denied involvement, but forensic evidence told a different story. Dr. Robert Williams, a forensic odontologist, compared bite marks found on Amora's body with bite dentition models taken from Milam, Carson, and Milam's brother Danny. Williams testified that Milam was a match for 8 of the bite marks. He excluded Carson from all but 1 and Danny from all but 1. In January 2009, while in Rusk County Jail, Milam called Nurse Shirley Broyles to his cell. She found him crying. He handed her a written request to talk to Sergeant Rogers and said, "I'm going to confess. I did it. But Monsieur Shirley, the Blaine you know did not do this." Why Dad told me to be a man and I've been reading my Bible. Please tell Jessica I love her. In separate interviews, both Milam and Carson admitted they believed Amora had been possessed by demons and were attempting to perform an exorcism. Milam's capital offense trial began in 2010. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. The bite mark analysis. The confession to Nurse Broyles. The surveillance video showing them pawning items instead of going to Clark Timber. The autopsy showing 30 hours of torture. After a 10-hour deliberation, the jury convicted Milam. After an additional 8-hour deliberation, they sentenced him to death. He was 20 years old. Carson was tried separately. She was convicted of capital offense for helping Milam and sentenced to life in prison without parole. She is serving her sentence at a female prison near Gatesville. Milam spent 17 years on death row at the Polunsky unit near Livingston, Texas. He participated in the faith-based program which began in 2021. Milam had execution dates in 2019 and 2021 that were stayed. His attorneys argued the bite mark evidence was unreliable. They claimed Milam was intellectually disabled and thus could not be constitutionally sentenced to death. They demanded access to DNA testing. They filed lawsuits claiming the state deprived Milam of due process, but every court rejected his appeals. The Texas Attorney General's office said Milam's claims of intellectual disability had been rejected in previous rulings. A recent review of DNA evidence continued to forensically tie him to Amora's body. Even if bite mark and DNA evidence were excluded, there was other evidence pointing to his guilt, including his efforts to hide evidence and his confession. On September 23, 2025, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously denied Milam's clemency request. On September 25, just hours before his execution, the United States Supreme Court denied his application for a stay. Rusk County District Attorney Michael Jimerson said he still couldn't pinpoint a motive. He believed the exorcism claim was just a way for Milam and Carson to cover up their offense. But very hard to confront the idea that someone would derive their gratification from the torture of a baby. That is really something that diminishes all of us, and it's just a very, very hard thing to face. That evening, Milam was taken to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. In a 2013 Werner Herzog documentary on death row, Milam called Amora a great little girl and claimed her first word was daddy. "I didn't cause my little girl to pass away," Milam said. "I wish I could go back and stop her, but I can't." For his final statement, Milam thanked supporters and the prison chaplaincy. "I would like to give a special thanks to all of you for showing me kindness, compassion, empathy, love and support, and believing in me. Thank you for everything that you have done. I would also like to thank the directors of chaplaincy of TDCJ for opening up the faith-based program on death row and allowed me to be accepted into it, to find Jesus Christ our Lord and Savior." Then he said, "If any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you, no matter who you are, to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again. I love you all. Bring me home, Jesus." The lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing at 6:14 p.m. At 6:40 p.m. on September 25, 2025, Blaine Keith Milam was pronounced deceased. He was 35 years old, just weeks away from his 36th birthday. This is what happens when you torture a baby for 30 hours. You think claiming demonic possession will excuse your actions. You bite a 13-month-old child 8 times. You break her skull, ribs, arm, and leg. You strangle her. You harm her in unspeakable ways. Richard Lee Tabler was born on February 5, 1979, in Tulare County, California. He grew up in a troubled home. His parents, Lorraine and Robert Tabler, had a difficult marriage that negatively affected his childhood. Tabler suffered from severe mental health issues, including attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, borderline personality disorder, and a history of head injuries. These conditions inhibited his ability to rationally assess situations and control his impulses. But mental illness doesn't excuse what he did. Between November 26 and November 28, 2004, Tabler went on a spree that left 4 people deceased in Killeen, Texas. Tabler worked at a strip club called Teasers in Killeen. The club was operated by 28-year-old Mohammed Amin Ramouni. Tabler and Ramouni got into a conflict. Tabler lost his job and was banned from the establishment. According to Tabler, Ramouni allegedly threatened to have Tabler's family wiped out for $10. Whether this threat was real or imagined, Tabler decided Ramouni had to pass away. On November 18, 2004, Tabler started planning. He bought a camcorder. He bought a pickup truck. He bought a 9mm gun. He recruited Timothy Doan Payne, an 18-year-old soldier from nearby Fort Hood, to help him. On November 26, 2004, Thanksgiving Day, Tabler contacted Ramouni. He offered to sell him stolen stereo equipment for $1,500. Ramouni agreed to meet. He brought his friend Hatham Frank Zaid, age 25, with him. They drove to a remote parking lot for the transaction. It was a trap. Tabler and Payne drove up next to their vehicle. Tabler opened fire with his 9mm gun. He shot both men multiple times while they sat in their car. Then Tabler pulled Ramouni out of the vehicle. He had Payne videotape him shooting Rahoney one final time. After both individuals passed away, Tabler and Payne checked the bodies for money and valuable items. They robbed the deceased men. Tabler kept the videotape as a trophy. But Tabler wasn't done. He had created a hit list of 11 employees from Rahoney's club, whom he planned to take from life. 2 days later, on November 28, 2004, Tabler targeted 2 teenage girls who worked as dancers at Teasers. Tiffany Lorraine Dotson was 18 years old. Amanda Benefield was 16 years old and a runaway from Louisiana. Tabler lured both girls out by promising them drugs. He drove them to a lake. Once they were isolated, Tabler turned his gun on both girls. He shot them multiple times. Dotson was taken from life immediately. Benefield passed away from her wounds. Tabler later confessed he eliminated them because he believed they were connecting him to the Thanksgiving Day incidents. After causing 4 individuals to pass away, Tabler started taunting authorities. He called the Bell County Sheriff's Office multiple times. He bragged about the incidents. He threatened to cause more club employees to pass away if police didn't close down Tabler's. He specifically threatened to target all the remaining employees on his hit list. He even threatened undercover law enforcement officers he believed were working at the club. On November 28, 2004, the same day he caused Dotson and Benefield to pass away, Tabler was arrested on unrelated felony theft charges. On February 26, 2005, both defendants pleaded not guilty. But Tabler later retracted his plea in his confession. He claimed he never perpetrated the incidents. On May 21, 2005, prosecutors confirmed they would seek the death penalty for Tabler. His defense filed a motion to remove the death penalty based on diminished responsibility due to his mental health issues. On January 26, 2007, Judge Martha Trudeau rejected the motion. The trial for the Thanksgiving incidents began in April 2007. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: Tabler's written and videotaped confessions, the actual video of Payne recording Tabler shooting Rahoney, forensic evidence connecting Tabler to the crime scenes, testimony from witnesses. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors also introduced Tabler's confessions to causing Dotson and Benefield to pass away. A psychiatrist testified about Tabler's mental health issues. But the jury also heard testimony about Tabler's history of threatening law enforcement officers and fellow inmates. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury ruled Tabler presented a continuing threat to society. They decided the evidence did not warrant a life sentence. Tabler was sentenced to death. Payne received life in prison after prosecutors chose not to pursue death in his case. Tabler spent 18 years on death row at the Pulaski unit near Livingston, Texas. While imprisoned, he exhibited erratic behavior. He had at least 2 suicide attempts. He was previously granted a stay in 2010. In 2008, Tabler smuggled a contraband cell phone into his cell. He used it to make threatening calls to State Senator John Whitmire, who led a committee with oversight of state prisons. Tabler warned Whitmire that he knew the names of his children and where they lived. This prompted an unprecedented lockdown of more than 150,000 inmates in the nation's second-largest prison system. Officers swept over 100 prisons to seize hundreds of contraband items including cell phones. Whitmire is now the mayor of Houston. Tabler repeatedly asked courts to drop his appeals and execute him, but he changed his mind multiple times. His attorneys questioned whether he was mentally competent to make that decision. The American Civil Liberties Union appealed to the United States Supreme Court, claiming Tabler was denied adequate legal representation. The ACLU argued his attorneys abandoned him by refusing to participate in hearings and ignored psychological evaluations showing he was severely mentally ill. But every court rejected his appeals. On December 9, 2024, Tabler wrote to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stating he had spent 20 years in courts and saw no point in wasting anyone's time. His execution was scheduled for February 13, 2025. That evening, Tabler was taken to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. Relatives of his individuals attended. Tiffany Dotson's father George was present. He had waited 20 years for this moment. Dotson's godfather Tom Newton said, "Today is for Tiffany, and this is justice." For his final statement, Tabler expressed remorse. Strapped to the gurney, he looked at the individuals' families through the window. "There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions," he said. "I had no right to take your loved ones from you, and I ask and pray, hope and pray, that one day you find it in your hearts to forgive me for those actions. No amount of my apologies will ever return them to you." He expressed love to his family, friends, lawyers, and supporters. He thanked prison officials for their compassion and the opportunity to show you that I can change and become a better man and rehabilitate. After apologizing several more times and saying this was the beginning of a new life for him in heaven, he told the warden, "I am finished." The lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing at 6:30 p.m. At 6:38 p.m. on February 13, 2025, Richard Lee Tabler was pronounced deceased. He was 46 years old, just 8 days after his 46th birthday. Moises Mendoza was born on January 26, 1984 in Mexico. He grew up in northern Texas where he attended grade school. In his early years, Mendoza was described as a hard-working individual, but as he got older, troubling behavior emerged. Neighbors recalled a disturbing incident where he violently pinned down his mother and sister in their front yard. Despite these warning signs, Mendoza graduated from high school with decent academic performance and earned several scholarships. He completed approximately 9 months of training in heating and air conditioning after graduation. But his life was about to take a darker turn. On March 18, 2004, Mendoza was 20 years old. That night, he entered the home of Rochelle O'Neill Tollison in Farmersville, Texas. Tollison was also 20 years old. She had graduated from high school alongside Mendoza. They were former classmates. Tollison lived alone with her 6-month-old daughter Avery while going through a divorce. Mendoza entered through an unlocked back door. What happened next was brutal. According to prosecutors, Mendoza abducted Tollison from her home, leaving her baby daughter alone. Mendoza claimed to investigators that they left together briefly to get cigarettes, but while driving, Mendoza went violent. He choked Tollison until she lost consciousness. He took her to a secluded area near his home. There he forcibly had intimate relations with her. Then he strangled her. He also stabbed her in the throat. Rochelle Tollison passed away in that field. The next morning, Tollison's mother went to check on her daughter. She found the back door wide open. Inside the bedroom, everything was in disarray. The mattress and box spring were misaligned. The headboard was damaged. Furniture was out of position. Papers and belongings were scattered everywhere. And baby Avery was alone. The infant was cold and wet but safe. Tollison was reported missing. Mendoza left Tollison's body in the field for a few days. Then he returned to the scene. He wrapped her body in a tarp and brought it to his cousin's land in Farmersville. He disposed of it by burning it and placing it in a creek bed. He was trying to hide his fingerprints by burning her body. On March 23, 2004, 6 days after Tollison disappeared, a man discovered her remains near the creek. Through dental records, police identified Tollison as the individual. Mendoza was arrested the next day after he reportedly told a friend that he took Tollison's life. Mendoza confessed to police, but he couldn't give detectives a reason for his actions. He told investigators he repeatedly choked Tollison, harmed her, dragged her body to a field, choked her again, and stabbed her in the throat. He admitted moving her body and burning it. Mendoza stood trial in 2005. His conviction was all but assured since he had confessed. The main task for his defense attorneys was to save him from death. But they failed. They called psychologist Mark Vigan as an expert witness to humanize Mendoza and explain what in his life might have mitigated his responsibility. But Vigan testified instead that nothing could explain Mendoza's actions and that he remained a dangerous man. Vigan told the jury that Mendoza lacks the internal compass that each of us has. Mendoza spent 20 years on death row at the Polunsky unit near Livingston, Texas. During that time, he filed multiple appeals. His attorneys argued that prosecutors used false testimony during sentencing to convince jurors he would be violent while incarcerated. They claimed his trial and appeals attorneys provided ineffective counsel by failing to challenge Hinton's testimony. They argued the jury specifically asked about Mendoza's criminal acts while in jail during deliberations, showing the testimony affected their decision. But every court rejected his appeals. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected appeals in November 2008 and May 2009. The U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas rejected appeals in September 2012 and April 2019. On October 7, 2024, the United States Supreme Court denied his final appeal. They said in the 20 years on death row, he had transformed from an impulsive, risk-taking late adolescent to an empathetic man of faith who had a positive influence on those around him. On April 21, 2025, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied his request to commute his death sentence. On April 23, 2025, just hours before his execution, the Supreme Court rejected his lawyer's final petition to block the execution. There were no more options. That evening, Mendoza was taken to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. Tollison's family members attended. For his final statement, Mendoza spoke in both English and Spanish. He addressed Tollison's family directly, to Mark, Pam, Austin, Uncle Troy, and Jose. I am sorry for having robbed you of Rochelle's life. To Avery, who I know is not here, I robbed you of a mother. I'm sorry for that. I know nothing that I could ever say or do would ever make up for that. I want you to know I am sincere. I apologize. Thank you for being here today. Not life. He then addressed his loved ones. To all my loved ones, I love you. I am with you. I'm well and at peace. You know that I'm well and everything is love. The lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing at 6:30 p.m. At 6:40 p.m. on April 23, 2025, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was pronounced deceased. He was 41 years old. Collin County District Attorney Greg Willis released a statement memorializing Tollison and claiming justice was finally carried out. Nothing can undo what Rochelle's loved ones have endured. But justice is not about erasing the past, it's about honoring the life that was taken. I hope tonight brings some measure of resolution to her family and friends. Attorney General Ken Paxton said 20 years after Mendoza violently took Rochelle Tollison's life, robbing her 5-month-old daughter of her mother, Texas has executed him.